lots of mangoes. And no, I don't grow them myself if the stickers weren't a dead giveaway, but these were on sale at my local supermarket. And what do I do when I get fruit that's on sale? I make jam. So today I'm going to show you this simple and equally delicious mango jam recipe that is shelf stable because we're going to also can it. For ingredients, you're going to, of course, need mangoes, sugar, bottled lemon juice, and pectin. I like to use Pomona's Universal Pectin because it's a low sugar pectin, which means you don't need to add a ton of sugar for the jam to, jam. For tools, you're going to need a pot. I love to use my Dutch oven. It is the only thing I use when I make my jam, but you can use whatever pot you have. You're also going to need an immersion blender. If you don't have one, it's okay. I'll show you how to use it with a regular blender. So since we're worried about canning, we are going to need something to actually can the jars. This is a canner, but you can use whatever pot that you have that has a lid that is large enough for you to input the jars and at least cover with a couple inches of water without boiling over. I'm using a canning rack. You can also use a dish towel if you don't have one of these. The purpose of this is just to provide a buffer between the bottom of the pot and the jars so that they don't come in direct contact with the heat and explode. You're also going to need a canning funnel, some type of ladle, canning tongs, and something to debubble. If you don't have one of these, you can also just use chopsticks. If you're starting from scratch, I recommend investing in a canning kit. All this stuff comes in it. It's readily available and extremely cost effective, especially compared to buying everything individually. And since we're canning, you're also going to need some canning jars. And these jars you can reuse time after time as long as they don't get any dings or scratches in them. At that point, they risk exploding under the pressure of the heat. And then for the rings, you can reuse them as long as they aren't overly rusty. However, you only want to use your lids once. That's because if you look under the lids, you have this area here, which includes a sealing compound, which activates with heat. This is only meant to be effective for one use. If you reuse your lids, you run the risk of your jars not sealing properly, and then you're going to run into food safety issues, which, If you are new to canning, which, yay, congratulations for taking the first step, I highly recommend you check out the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Here you'll find a digital copy of the complete home canning guide as written by the USDA. The digital version is completely free, so you have literally no excuse. However, if you would prefer a printed copy like this, these are not free. So I'll leave a link below for both the digital as well as the printed versions. Whichever version you choose, familiarize yourself with it. First, you're going to start off with clean jars. If you are going to be using a dishwasher, you want to make sure you run the jars through a full cycle. And also toss in any of the accessories I'm going to be using. Not only does the dishwasher clean the jars, but it also keeps them warm. This is important because we don't want any sudden fluctuations in temperature, which might shock and break the glass. You obviously can wash everything by hand. If you do this, you want to keep your jars warm. And you can do this by simply filling your canner and putting it in your jars so that they're covered by about 1 inch of water and just allowing them to simmer on the stove. Either way, this is the time to prep your canner on top of the stove. If you don't have a jar rack like this, you can simply put a dishcloth at the bottom of the canner. This will prevent the jars from coming in direct contact from the heat at the bottom of the pot. There isn't a need to sterilize your jars if the processing time is at least 10 minutes. If you're like my Nana who always sterilized her jars no matter what she was canning, you're going to add your jars to the canner and cover with about 1 inch of water. If you live at an elevation of less than 1,000 feet, you're going to bring to a full boil for 10 minutes. However, if you live at a higher elevation, you're going to add 1 additional minute for each additional 1,000 feet. For example, if you live somewhere with an elevation of 3,000 feet, in order to sterilize your jars, you are going to boil for 12 minutes. For the rings and lids, just wash with warm soapy water and rinse thoroughly. To prep the fruit, start off by cleaning thoroughly. Next, you're going to peel the mangoes. You can either use a peeler, a knife, or if you have mangoes that are incredibly ripe like these, you can just cut a little slit in it and the skin will just peel right off using your hands. I don't know why, but this process was incredibly satisfying. Next, you're going to cut the flesh of the mango away from the pit. Now that we've pitted our extremely ripe mangoes, and this smells heavenly, by the way. And yes, I have mango juice and water everywhere. I made a complete mess, but that's okay. It is time to blend them. I'm going to be using an immersion blender, but if you don't have one of these, that's okay. You can just use a normal blender. However, depending on how much mango you have, you might have to do this step in batches. If you are using an immersion blender, I highly recommend that the bowl you use is either metal or even plastic. I would avoid glass to avoid having the blade from the blender nick it and potentially damage it. Now that everything is blended and you have officially made mango puree, you're going to measure out how much you actually have. Now, this step is important because this is going to dictate how much pectin you're going to need to add for your jam to jam. This made 10 full cups of mango puree. As you can see, this is at the brim. So now that we know how much puree we have, now I'm just going to follow the manufacturer's instructions for the pectin to understand what measurements I need. Another reason why I like the Pomona's pectin is that the measurements can be doubled, it can be quadrupled, it could be halved or even quartered, which isn't the case for every type of pectin. The general recipe in the Pomona's kind of manual here is based on 4 cups of mashed fruit or pureed fruit. And since I have 10 cups, I know that I have to multiply the measurements by 2.5. Yeah, 2.5. If you're using Pomona's pectin, you're going to follow the instructions included in the box to create the calcium water. Now, the calcium is already included, but calcium is what actually activates the pectin for the Pomona's. And after you make your recipe, if you still have calcium water left over, don't worry. It will store for several months in an airtight container in the refrigerator. Next, you're going to measure out your sweetener of choice. For this recipe, I'm just using sugar. And for the 10 cups of mango puree, I ended up using 3¼ cups of sugar. Which, in the world of jam making, ain't crazy. Measure out the appropriate amount of pectin according to the instructions. Add the pectin to the sweetener and mix thoroughly. This is going to ensure the pectin is evenly dispersed in your jam mixture, and it's also going to help prevent clumps. Next, pour your mango puree in the pot on a medium heat. Add the appropriate amount of lemon juice and calcium water. Stir thoroughly and bring to a full boil. You'll know it's at a full boil when you go to stir it, you can't stir out the boils. Next, you're going to add your sugar pectin mixture and stir until dissolved. Bring back to a full boil for 1 to 2 minutes. It's important to not let the pectin cook for longer than 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, the pectin will start to break down and you risk your jam not jamming. As you are waiting, prep your workspace by laying down a clean dishcloth as well as removing your jars either from the dishwasher or the canner and gathering all the utensils you're going to be using to fill your jars. Once the jam has boiled for the appropriate amount of time, turn off the burner. Rest the funnel on top of the rim of the jars and use the ladle to ladle in the jam. You want to leave about 1/4 inch of head space. And head space is the amount of space between the contents of the jar and the brim of the jar. I love this funnel because it has the tick marks for the measurements for headspace already on it. You can also use a measuring tool that's specific to canning that comes in most canning kits. If you don't have either and you're using a standard mason jar, you'll notice that the 1/4 inch mark is just under the first thread of the jar. Next, we want to remove any potential air pockets in the liquid by debubbling. To debubble, all you're going to do is either take a debubbler, the end of a plastic utensil, a chopstick. You just don't want to use anything metal as it can scratch the glass. And then you're going to insert the utensil and gently move it up and down, going alongside the edges of the jar. After debubbling, you may find that the contents of the jar has gone down. Simply readjust the headspace by topping it off with more of the liquid. Next, you're going to want to clean the rim of the jar by either dipping a clean cloth or paper towel in some vinegar. This is to remove any contents that may have spilled on the rim of the jar and may prevent the jar from achieving a proper seal. Next, you're going to place the lids on top of the rims of the jars. Then you're going to add the rings, but we want to make sure we don't screw the rings onto too tight, as this could cause the lids to buckle and for the jars to explode in the canner. So to prevent this, we only tighten to finger tight. To do this, all you do is add the rings and gently tighten with your fingertips until you feel a slight give. Still using your fingertips, give the ring a gentle quarter turn. And next, you're going to add the jars to the canner using your canning tongs. Once you've loaded the jars, add the lid and turn the burner up to high. We're almost there, y'all. So the processing time you're going to leave the jars in the canner are going to be dependent on your altitude. Now, the general processing time for this recipe is 10 minutes. However, you're going to add 1 additional minute for every 1,000 feet you live above sea level. And remember, the processing time starts once you add the lid and the canner comes to a full rolling boil. Can you tell it's hot in my kitchen? I am like sweating. But we are almost at the finish line. Once the processing time is complete, you're going to remove the lid and allow the canner to sit uncovered for about 5 minutes before removing the jars. This is just going to give everything time to simmer down. Now it's time for the hardest part, y'all, waiting. Once you remove the jars from the canner, you're going to let them sit out undisturbed for at least 12 hours, but no more than 24 hours. Something to note, your jam will be liquidy as long as it's warm, so don't freak out. As your jam cools, it will set, assuming the instructions were followed properly. And through the magic of television, it is the next day, and it has been about 16 hours since I initially took my jars out the canner. And if all good is planned, all of my jars should have a nice, tight seal. Now, if you're a beginner, you might be wondering, like, how do you know when your jars are sealed properly? Well, there's a couple of ways. The first, more obvious one, as you take your jars out the canner, sometimes you'll hear that beautiful popping noise. That's actually the sound of the jar sealing. If you look at a lid, you'll see there's this raised area here, and it has a bit of give. You can hear it? Well, as the jars seal, this gets sucked down, and this area becomes flat. However, if you're still not sure, another method is you can simply just pick up your jars from the lid. If it does not separate from the jar, then you've got yourself a seal. The next part I absolutely have to call out because it is contrary to popular belief. You're going to store your jars without the rings. That's right. These rings should not be what keeps your lid on the jar. It is the suctioning action that happens through the canning process and the sealing compound around the lid that seals your jar. You might be thinking, okay, that's great, but what's the big deal about keeping the rings on the jars? But what could happen is when you leave the rings on the jars, it can create what's called a false seal. And what does this mean? You could have a situation where your jar does not properly seal. However, you wouldn't know that because you have the ring holding the seal down. And what that can do is it can create its own suctioning action, which seals the lid. However, it has not been sealed properly and safely. Another thing that can happen is if, say, maybe you don't have the tightest seal on your jars, the seal can actually give way over time. However, again, if you are storing your jars with the rings, you wouldn't potentially know that because, again, there's a potential of it to create that suctioning action to create a false seal. In either instance, your jars have been contaminated and you run the risk of food safety issues. So just do not store your jars with the rings. If you have hard water like me, you might notice this white residue on the outside of your jars and lids. This is completely normal, and this is just a mineral buildup from the minerals in your water. Typically, I will put vinegar in my water in the canner, and this will prevent this. However, I forgot to do that this time. But no big deal. I'm just simply going to wipe it down with a cloth that I'm going to soak in a bit of vinegar. And don't forget to label and date your jars. We are done. If you have stuck with me this entire time, God bless you. I appreciate you. If you recall, we started off with 10 cups of mango puree, and that made 8 half-pint jars, 2 full-pint jars, and a full-pint container for immediate consumption. So that tallies to about 7 pints of jam, most of which I will just be gifting. Now, we jam. This jam is jamming. Like, perfect consistency for jam, if I do say so myself. Y'all, this, I could spoon this, like, consume this by the spoonful. This is delicious. I mean, I knew it was gonna be good because I make this quite often, but like, y'all, if you love mangoes, you love jam, this is the jam. This is also really good whenever I have people over. I make crostinis, and what I'll do is I'll take some baguettes and then add some cream cheese, little mango jam on top with maybe some nuts or like some fruit. So nothing goes to waste around here. Now that our jam is done, I'm actually going to be putting the scraps of mangoes as well as some other kitchen scraps I had in the compost bin, and eventually it will replenish and nourish my garden and plants, and the cycle of life continues. It turned out to be a gorgeous day today, contrary to what the weather forecast said. The sun's in my face, the wind's blowing through my hair, I got jam in the pantry. I'm a busy girl. So I'm gonna stick out here a while and harvest some produce, just some chard here, and figure out what I'm gonna do for meal prep this week. Somebody wants some attention. Hello. I think Ritz wants to join the party. Ritzy, you want some chard? Well, I guess I owe them some playtime because I have been preoccupied with my jam. He is full of energy and he wants some love. You already know the deal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And remember, every black thumb ripens to green, and it all just starts with the seed.